Hello and welcome to the Hanbali History Hour, a production in conjunction with the Abbasid History Podcast exclusive to Ramadan Radio. My name is Talha Ahsan, currently a PhD student in Islamic history, and for our four-part series, we will introduce listeners to the lives of important historic figures from the Hanbali community, the smallest of the four schools of Sunni Islam, and we will learn about their contribution to the Muslim nation and the world. I am passionate about history and I want you to be too. So stay with us as together we learn and become inspired. Part 3. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, 1077 to 1166 Common Era, the Grey Falcon. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani was born in 1077 and died in 1166, and all dates will be Common Era unless stated otherwise. Although he was born in the province of Gilan or Gilan on the Caspian Sea, he moved to Baghdad during his teenage years and was to spend the rest of his life there. This period was one of great change in the Muslim lands, especially for Baghdad and the surrounding country. It saw the rise to power of the Seljuks, a powerful Turkic dynasty who would become the de facto rulers of the Caliphate. For this episode, we will rely upon the work of Hamza Malik, called The Grey Falcon, a biography of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani based upon his PhD. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani was called the Grey Falcon because the falcon loyally returns to the hand of his master, just as Abdul Qadir al-Jilani always returned back to God. We will look at the background to the life of this great Muslim figure, first starting with the city in which he lived, Baghdad. The city of Baghdad, from its foundation until the end of the period that concerns us here, had undergone profound change. Founded in 762 by the Caliph al-Mansur near the site of an earlier settlement, the city had seen its prime during the Middle Abbasid period, 8th to 9th century. During the early part of the 10th century, the rule of the Abbasids had become weaker and weaker and had ended in all but name with the coming of the Buyids in 945. The city had thus lost its honour of being the real capital of the Islamic world, for though it still was the city of the Caliph, the Islamic lands had by now been divided and were controlled by various autonomous rulers. It had to compete with the capitals of these autonomous regions, cities such as Cairo, Damascus, Cordova, and Shiraz all laid a claim to being the greatest. Baghdad had also by this time declined economically, partly due to the loss of tax revenue after the split up of the empire, but due to a move in the trade routes from the east, which instead of going through the Persian Gulf, now ran through the Red Sea. The later 9th and earlier 10th century is often referred to as the Shia century, due to the growth in power of the Shia in Baghdad, especially after the arrival of the Buyids. However, by the middle of the 10th century, the fortunes of the Shia were changing, and the following period from the arrival of the Seljuks in Baghdad until the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258 is often termed the Sunni revival. This was in part due to the growth of Sunni power politically, and in part due to the increase in scholastic output by the Sunni community, something that had been partly been driven by a greater feeling of awareness after witnessing the earlier decline in power. There were 8 masjids that taught Hanbali law. However, the first Hanbali madrasa was that of Abu Sa'd al-Mukharrimi, one of the teachers of Jilani and a student of Abu Ya'la, whose life we discussed in episode 2. This madrasa was founded somewhere near the end of the 11th or beginning of the 12th century. The madrasa was later used by Jilani as his residence and teaching place, and in 1134 was expanded to accommodate the ever-growing crowds. It was also renamed as a madrasa of Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. There was one only other Hanbali madrasa that we know about from this early period. Other madrasas for the Hanbalis were not founded until the later half of the 12th century. Thus, the Hanbali vizier Ibn Hubayra, whose life we will cover in the final episode of the Hanbali History Hour, founded a madrasa in 1161, and in 1174 Ibn al-Jawzi founded his own madrasa, in addition to being given the chair to another madrasa that had been founded by the wife of the Caliph al-Mustadi. Other patrons of the Hanbalis in Baghdad were the great merchant Abu Mansur ibn Yusuf, who was responsible for founding many masjids, libraries and zawiyas, and Abu Abdullah ibn Jarada, another wealthy merchant of Baghdad. There seems to have been some dislike for madrasas amongst the Hanbalis of Baghdad. Many Hanbali scholars saw it as a bad thing to teach in a madrasa, or to teach only in a madrasa and not in a masjid as well. Thus we find a great masjid to madrasa ratio for the Hanbalis in comparison with the other law schools. The primary reason for this might have stemmed from the fact that a madrasa was the only institution where the person who endowed the institution had the power to appoint the teachers. There was a strong, conservative Hanbali tradition against any involvement in a political affairs or to subject oneself to any sort of influence from a rich patron. The idea of having a madrasa built by somebody in government may have seemed akin to being appointed a government position itself, whereby the scholar could have become subject to influence of the patron through a feeling of gratitude towards that patron. As the 12th century wore on and the 13th century began, institutions were opened that were not exclusive to any particular school. The Dar al-Quran and the Dar al-Hadith were founded approximately 100 years after the establishment of the first madrasas in Baghdad. They aimed to raise the status of Quran and Hadith studies to that of law. The student did not have to be of any particular school of law. This process was topped off in 1234 with the establishment of the Mustansiriya, which housed all 4 schools of law. The government of Baghdad wanted more unity amongst the scholars and thought that this would remove the sectarian element brought about, they thought, by the exclusivist tendencies in madrasas. The Seljuks also thought that pluralism in Islam was to be found in Sufism. Thus Sufi ribats, khanaqahs and zawiyas were also encouraged. This not only made Sufi associations more respectable and acceptable, but in quote, officializing these institutions, they found another source of unity. Initially, Sufis would teach Quran and Hadith in the mosques of Baghdad, and this slowly moved to ribats, which ultimately became centers of learning, just like the madrasas. The first ribat of Baghdad was founded by a Hanbali, Abul Hasan al-Zawzani, opposite the Jami' al-Mansur, an area dominated by Hanbalis. These Sufi monasteries were again institutions that were open access to students from all schools of law. Having gained an overview of the political and social atmosphere in Baghdad leading up to and during the life of Jilani, we will now turn to the life of Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. Jilani's life may roughly be divided into 2 general phases. The first of his youth and education, of finding himself and gaining a good grounding in the spiritual aspect of Islam, and the second of teaching, giving sermons to large crowds and guiding new adherents on the spiritual path. The first phase amounts to roughly the first 40 or 50 years of his life, while the second phase amounts to the remainder of his life, again a 40 or 50 year period. The first phase. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani was born in the year 1077 in the village of Nif, which is situated in an area to the northeast of Iraq and south of the Caspian, known as Gilan. The area roughly corresponds to the province of the same name in modern-day Iran. Jilani was born into a well-respected family descended from the 4th Caliph Ali on both sides. There is an anecdote related in the hagiographies with regard to his initial journey to Baghdad that illustrates his uprightness and truthfulness even as a young boy, and there seems no reason to doubt its veracity. Before Jilani left his home, his mother gave him some money for the journey and to get him started in Baghdad. She took 40 dinars that she had inherited from her father and sewed it into the lining under the armpit of his shirt. She then made him promise to always tell the truth, regardless of the situation, and with this Jilani departed, never to see his mother in person again. During the journey, while passing through an area called Falat, the small caravan was attacked by a group of around 60 bandits. Initially, none of the highwaymen took any notice of Jilani, but after a while one of them came to him and asked if he had anything of worth. Jilani answered that he had 40 dinars under his armpit sewn into the cloth. The bandit, thinking that Jilani was trying to be funny, left him alone. After a while, all the thieves gathered on a nearby hill and began to divide all the loot they had obtained from the caravan. The bandit who had spoken with Jilani at that point informed their leader what he had heard from him, and Jilani was called to answer to the head of the gang. The man asked Jilani what he had with him, and he again answered that he had 40 dinars sewn into the lining of his clothes, specifically under the armpit area. The man ordered the cloth ripped up and found therein the 40 dinars that Jilani had told him about. The leader inquired why he had told them about the 40 dinars at all, for if he had kept quiet, they would not have found it and bothered him any further. Jilani replied that he had promised his mother to always tell the truth and that he could not break his promise to her. The bandit, thinking about this, began to weep from shame and exclaimed that while Jilani did not break a single promise made to his mother, he, the bandit, had not kept the promise of his lord for all these years. He then repented at the hands of Jilani. His gang followed suit, and they decided to return all they had taken from the caravan. Jilani counts this as the first incident of someone repenting at his hands. Jilani arrived in Baghdad in the year 1095, just as a perplexed Imam al-Ghazali was leaving the city. Over the next few years, he studied under an array of different teachers. Jilani, who had grown up in a quiet village, was shocked to see the levels of decadence attained in the Abbasid capital, and he truly believed that staying in the city was harming his faith. In addition to this was the fact that Baghdad as a world capital had very high prices that made day-to-day living a very difficult exercise for a poor student. There was no agricultural land in the city where Jilani could work as he had done in Gilan, and so he had to try and find menial work to be able to pay for the basic necessities of life, such as food. During these years, Jilani ate very little and, according to his own statements, often fainted from hunger. At this time, Jilani was also experiencing many spiritual states that he was not able to fully understand or comprehend. These states would often lead him to fits of ecstasy, which to an outside observer could only be comprehended as insanity. It was during this period that he spent much of his time outside the city in the desert and wastelands or ruins around Baghdad, and he became known in these areas as Abdul Qadir al-Majnoon, the crazy one. During one of these incidents, a fit of insanity caused him to be taken to a madhouse in the city, where the fit of ecstasy put him into a sort of paralyzed state. The people there thought he had died and started preparing the funeral shrouds for him when he suddenly came out of the fit and back to normal life. Jilani was very troubled by these fits and states that would involuntarily overcome him, and in later life commented that such heavy burdens were put on him as to crush a mountain. When he felt that he could no longer cope, he would lay down on his side and recite the Quranic verse, "With every difficulty there is ease," over and over again until the weight was lifted from him and he was normal again. He wished to find somebody who could explain these states to him and, more importantly, help him remove them. During this time, he was once passing through the Zafariya quarter of Baghdad when a man opened his door and asked Jilani what he had been seeking the previous day. Jilani, confused and having forgotten, remained silent, at which the man became angry and slammed the door. Afterwards, he remembered and realized that it must have been concerning his fits, so went back to look for the man, but unfortunately could not recognize the door. This had been the second time he met Hamad al-Dabbas. He afterwards got to know Dabbas, who cleared up all his difficulties, and he started accompanying him in order to get a good understanding of spiritual matters. According to Jilani's own admission, Dabbas treated him very badly and sometimes even beat him. Yet it seems that this was all part of the spiritual and character training that Dabbas was putting him through. For example, when Jilani would return to Dabbas and his followers after a law lesson, Dabbas would mockingly ask him what connection a jurist had with them, and that he belonged not with them but with the jurists. If he would ever come to Dabbas hungry, then he would be told that they, Dabbas and his disciples, had eaten much bread and sweetmeat that day, but had saved none for Jilani, as they did not want his company. There is even a famous report that once, in the height of winter, Jilani was accompanying Dabbas and his followers to the mosque for the Friday prayer, when Dabbas pushed him off a bridge over the Tigris that they were walking upon, and into the cold river water. Always making the best of a situation, he told himself that this would count as his Friday bath. Jilani had on a woolen garment, and after getting out of the water, wringed it as dry as he could, and proceeded to follow the party, which had carried on. He suffered severely from the cold, yet neither this nor any of the other incidents of ill treatment deterred him from accompanying Dabbas as much as he was able. He understood that Dabbas was no ordinary person or teacher, and he knew that he had a rare sort of knowledge that was not easily come by, for was it not Dabbas who had been the one to explain his fits and states in addition to removing them? That this was indeed one of the ways that Dabbas was training him became clear when one day he caught his disciples teasing Jilani in the way of their master, telling him that he was a jurist and did not belong with them. Dabbas immediately scolded them, informing them that there was not one among them worthy of his rank, and that he only teased Jilani in order to test and prove him, and that he had found him to be as firm as a mountain. Jilani also had Mukharrami, one of his teachers in Hanbali law, as a spiritual guide. In fact, Jilani's spiritual sanad, or chain of transmission, runs back through Mukharrami and not Dabbas. This may be because he met Mukharrami first, and therefore accepted the line of transmission from him. It may also have been that although he accompanied Dabbas, he did not ever become a formal disciple of his. After gaining a good mastery over the spiritual element of Islam in both its practical and theoretical aspects, and having already become an expert in Islamic law and various other Islamic sciences, including wa'az, the art of giving a good speech or sermon, it became an obvious move for Jilani to begin teaching and guiding others in all that he had learnt. The next stage of Jilani's life is that of a teacher of various subjects, a famous preacher, and a guide for the spiritual path. From this short sketch for the first period of Jilani's life, we can see that his educational phase lasted just under 20 years between 1095 and around 1112, after which he went through a transitional phase for a few years before beginning teaching in earnest around 1119. To contextualize, Imam al-Ghazali died in 1111. Jilani began teaching at the age of 43 and to speak publicly just after reaching the age of 50. The next phase of his life, that of teaching and preaching, would last around 40 years, between 1127 and his death in 1166. It is to this part of his life that our attention must now be turned. A physical description is given by Muwaffaq ad-Din ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, the famous Hanbali jurist, who describes Jilani as slender, of medium height and wide build, with brown skin, a wide and long beard, joined eyebrows with deep black eyes, and a loud voice. Ibn Qudama studied law under Jilani for just over 30 days, at which point Jilani passed away. Thus, we can be sure that his description is of the man when he had reached the advanced age of 90. He would wear the clothes of the scholars of the time, and was also known for wearing a taylasan, a shawl-like garment worn over the head and shoulders. When he needed to travel around the city, he would ride on the back of a mule. With the expansion of the madrasa in 1134, Jilani found a permanent dwelling for himself and his family within the new complex. The madrasa complex also contained a ribat, which was in essence a residence for his murids, disciples. It was the habit of Jilani to only come out of his madrasa on Fridays for the prayer. His day would otherwise consist of teaching, preaching in open lectures, and spending some time with his disciples in the ribat. After the Isha night prayer, he would go into his room and not come out until the Fajr dawn prayer. A certain Harawi spent a night with Jilani and said that after Isha he prayed a little and did a chant of God's names until the first third of the night was over. He then prayed standing and reciting the Quran till the second third of the night had passed. In these prayers he would lengthen the prostrations. Then he sat quietly until a little before dawn, at which point he made prayers of supplication and self-abasement, and a light covered him so bright that Harawi could not see him, though he could hear salutations of Assalamu alaikum, and Jilani would return the salutations until he went out for the dawn prayer. Jilani taught 13 different subjects in his madrasa. He would begin the day with lessons in tafsir, Quran exegesis, then hadith, then fiqh, and then khilaf, comparative law, and would teach the various readings of the Quran after the Dhuhr midday prayers. He also had lessons on usul, principles of jurisprudence, grammar and literature. In addition to this, he would also be asked to give legal rulings, fatwa, on various matters which he was able to do in accordance with both the Hanbali and Shafi'i schools of law. If he was given such a query, then he would not sleep until he had read its contents, and his habit was to then immediately answer it by determining the legal ruling. This he would do without having to think. His skill in being able to answer even the most difficult queries is highlighted by an anecdote. Abdul Razak al-Jilani reported an incident when the request for a fatwa came to Baghdad with regard to a man who had taken a religious oath to divorce his wife unless he was able to perform some canonical worship of God which no other person on earth would be engaged in at the particular time of performance. All the scholars of the city were baffled as to what should be advised, as they could think of no form of worship that would fit the criteria. When the query was brought to Jilani, he immediately answered it, saying that the man must make 7 circumambulations of the Kaaba in the holy sanctuary in Mecca while nobody else was doing it, and that he would then be freed from his oath. Jilani's preaching was separate to his teaching. He would give sermons 3 times a week, on Friday morning and Tuesday evening in the madrasa, and on Sunday morning in the ribat. His sessions always begin with a recitation from the Quran, and for this purpose he had 2 very adept reciters. It is claimed that there were often nearly 400 people writing down what he said, which, if true, would allow us to consider the collections of his sermons quite accurate. After the sermons, he would answer fatwas presented to him. It seems he initially, i.e. after 1127, gave his sermons at the madrasa, but in time became too small, and so he moved to the oratory of the Halaba gate. This also became too small, and the pulpit had to be brought inside the wall between the furnaces. People used to come to these gatherings with candles and torches on the backs of horses, mules and donkeys, and the reports claim that over 70,000 persons would attend. After 1134, when the madrasa had been expanded, the sermons were given there once more. Jilani used to deliver his sermons from a high pulpit so that the vast crowds were able to hear him, and he was not afraid to speak his mind. Thus it is recorded that after the Caliph al-Muqtafi, who reigned from 1135 to 1141, appointed Wafa ibn al-Murakhim, an unjust scholar it would seem, as a judge, Jilani rebuked him in a sermon saying, "You have today appointed over the Muslims the most abhorred of transgressors. What will be your answer tomorrow to the Lord of the worlds?" Through his sermons, he had a great effect on the people of Baghdad. He claimed to have converted over 500 persons to Islam and reformed countless thieves and bandits. As could be expected, he received many gifts of money and other things from the people, and these he would distribute amongst the poor without discriminating between the deserving and the undeserving. This in turn would encourage people to attend his sermons, and he was thus able to provide spiritual as well as temporal aid. Yet it would seem that it was not the words that Jilani spoke which had such an effect on the people, but rather something inherent in his being or personality. Jilani himself said that he would receive orders and prohibitions and what was to be said in sleep and while awake, until he could contain himself no longer and had to address the people. His son Abdul Wahhab relates that on returning to Baghdad after studying abroad, he asked his father if he might address the people in his father's gathering. Jilani gave permission, and although he had studied well and mastered the science of preaching, he could not stir the crowd with his words. They in turn became restless and called upon Jilani to speak to them. Jilani then proceeded to relate to them how the previous day his wife had boiled an egg for him and put it in a plate, when a cat came and playing around with it broke it. The crowd was instantly captivated by this trivial story. His son afterwards asked how it was that he was able to affect them in such a manner, and he replied that when he ascended onto the pulpit, the truth would manifest in his heart and would tell him what to say. At some point in time, Jilani acquired some land which was cultivated for him by the people of Rishaqa. They were able to produce bread from the wheat grown there, and he received this daily, keeping for himself what he needed and distributing the rest to those that needed it. He was also able to live off money that was gifted to him, or money that was vowed by people wanting to attain some particular thing, i.e., that if they were able to attain their aim, they would give a certain amount of money in a good cause, although he would himself make gifts of most of this money too. His wives also took care of him financially, and his contemporary Shihab ad-Din as-Suhrawardi quoted him as saying that there wasn't one of them that did not spend on me with goodwill and the utmost desire to do so. Over the course of his life, Jilani had 49 children, 27 of them male and 22 female. In early 1165 to 1166, Jilani became very ill, and it became clear to his family that he was near death. When his son Abdul Aziz asked him about his illness, he replied that nobody should ask him about anything, that nobody knew what his illness was, nor could anybody comprehend it. His son Abdul Jabbar asked him where he felt pain. To this he replied that all of his body was aching except his heart, which was with God. He kept repeating Allah, Allah, until his voice grew faint and his tongue began to stick to the roof of his mouth, at which point he passed away. Various days are given for his death, the 8th, 10th, 11th, 17th, all of the 4th month of Rabi' al-Thani in February 1166, at which time he was 90 years old. Thank you for listening. I've been your host Talha Ahsan on the Humbly History Hour, a production by the Abbasid History Podcast exclusive to Ramadan Radio at 87.9 FM and streaming on ramadanradio.org and Facebook. Ramadan Mubarak.